incredible honor for me to be presenting tonight the Lifetime Leadership Award to a man who demonstrates without any doubt what a difference one committed, passionate, and daunted man can make. Thank you. Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Tomorrow is my 69th birthday. And I cannot imagine a better present than this award and your company. 53 years ago tomorrow, on my 16th birthday, I went to work for the daily newspaper in the small East Texas town where I grew up. It was a good place to be a cub reporter, small enough to navigate, but big enough to keep me busy and learning something every day. I soon had a stroke of luck. Some of the old-timers were out on vacation or out sick, and I got assigned to cover what came to be known as the Housewives' Rebellion. 15 women in my hometown decided not to pay the Social Security withholding tax for their domestic workers. They argued that Social Security was unconstitutional, that imposing it was taxation without representation, and that, here's my favorite part, requiring us to collect the tax is no different from requiring us to collect the garbage. They hired themselves a lawyer, none other than Martin Dies, the former congressman best known or worst known for his work as head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities in the 30s and 40s. He was no more effective at defending rebellious women than he was protecting against communist subversives. And eventually, the women wound up holding their noses and paying the tax. The stories I wrote for my local paper were picked up and moved on to the Associated Press wire. One day, the managing editor called me over and pointed to the AP ticker beside his desk, and moving across the wire was a notice to editors citing one Bill Moyers and the paper for the reporting we had done on the rebellion. That hooked me. And in one way or another, after a detour through seminary and then into politics and government for a spell, I've been covering the class war ever since. Those women in Marshall were not bad people. They were regulars at church. Their children were my friends. They were active in community affairs. Their husbands were pillars of the business and professional class in town. They were respectable and upstanding citizens in all. So it took me a while to figure out what had brought on that spasm of reactionary rebellion. And it came to me one day, many years later. They simply couldn't see beyond their own prerogatives. Fiercely loyal to their families, to their clubs, charities, and congregations. Fiercely loyal, in other words, to their own kind. They narrowly defined membership in democracy to include only people like them. The women who washed and ironed their laundry, wiped their children's bottoms, made their husbands' beds, and cooked their family meals. These women, too, would grow old and frail, sick and decrepit, lose their husbands, and face the ravages of time alone, with nothing to show from their years of labor but the crease in their brow and the knots on their knuckles. So be it, it was said. Even on the distaff side of laissez-faire, security was personal, not social, and what injustice existed this side of heaven would no doubt be redeemed beyond the pearly gates. God was just once you got past Judgment Day. In one way or another, this is the oldest story in America. The struggle to determine whether we, the people, is a spiritual idea embedded in a political reality, one nation, indivisible, or merely a charade masquerading as piety and manipulated by the powerful and privileged to sustain their own way of life at the expense of others. Let me make it clear, I don't harbor any idealized notion of politics and democracy. I worked for Lyndon Johnson, remember? Nor do I romanticize the people. You should read my mail or listen to the anonymous messages left on my answering machine. And I remember the politician who said of the Texas House of Representatives, if you think these guys are bad, you should see their constituents. But there is nothing idealized or romantic about the difference between a society whose arrangements roughly serve all its citizens or one whose institutions have been converted into a stupendous fraud. That difference is often the difference between democracy and oligarchy. As Maria indicated a moment ago, and Regina, we all know that the American Revolution ushered in what one historian called the age of democratic revolutions. For the great seal of the United States, the new Congress went all the way back to the Roman poet Virgil, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new age now begins. Their ambition was not merely to free themselves from the independence and subordination to the crown, but to inspire people everywhere to create agencies of government and forms of common social life that would offer greater dignity and hope to the exploited and suppressed, to those who had long been the losers. Not surprisingly, the winners resisted. In the early years of constitution making in the states and the emerging nation, aristocrats wanted a government of propertied gentlemen to keep the scales tilted in their favor. Battling on the other side were moderates and even those radicals advocating the extraordinary idea of letting all white males have the vote. Luckily, the weapons were words and ideas, not bullets, and through compromise and conciliation, the draftsmen achieved a constitution of checks and balances that is now the oldest in the world, even as the revolution of democracy that inspired it remains a tempestuous adolescent whose destiny is still uncertain. The American Revolution is ongoing, growing by painful and often tentative steps and many times losing ground. For all the rhetoric about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it took a civil war to free the slaves and another 100 years to invest their freedom with meaning. Women only gained the right to vote in my mother's time because new ages don't arrive overnight or without blood, sweat, and tears. You know this. You are the heirs of one of the country's great traditions, the progressive movement that started late in the 19th century and remade the American experience piece by piece until it peaked in the third part of the 20th century. I call it the progressive movement for lack of a more precise term. Its aim was to keep blood pumping through the veins of democracy when others were willing to call in the mortician. Progressives exalted and extended the American Revolution. They spelled out new terms of partnership between the people and their rulers, and they kindled a flame that lit some of the most prosperous decades in modern history, not only here, but in aspiring democracies everywhere, especially those in Western Europe. I want to tell you a story. And to begin that story, I want to ask you to step back with me to the curtain raiser, to the founding convention of the People's Party, better known as the Populists in 1892. The members were mainly cotton and wheat farmers from the recently reconstructed South and the newly settled Great Plains, and they had come on hard times, driven to the wall by falling prices for their crops on one hand and racking interest rates, freight charges, and supply costs on the other. This in the midst of a booming and growing industrial America. They were angry, and their platform, issued deliberately on the 4th of July, pulled no punches. We meet, it said, in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the state legislatures, and the Congress, and touches even the bench. The newspapers, I'm reading from the platform, The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled, public opinion silenced, and the fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few. Furious words from rural men and women who were traditionally conservative and whose memories of taming the frontier were fresh and personal. But in their fury, they invoked an American tradition as powerful as frontier individualism, the war on inequality, and especially on the role that government played in promoting and preserving inequality by favoring the rich. The founding fathers had turned their backs on the idea of property qualifications for holding office under the Constitution because they wanted no part of a veneration for wealth in the document. Thomas Jefferson, while claiming no interest in politics, built a Republican Party, no kin to the present, to take the government back from the speculators and stock jobbers, as he called them, who were in the saddle in 1800. Andrew Jackson slew the monster Second Bank of the United States, that 600-pound gorilla of the credit system of the 1830s, in the name of the people versus the aristocrats who sat on the bank's governing board. All of these leaders, I don't have to remind you, were on record in favor of small government, but their opposition wasn't simply to government as such. It was the government's power to confer privilege on insiders, on the rich who were democracy's equivalent of the royal favorites of monarchy. You know, it's what the FCC did this week. The populists saw that it was the government that granted millions of acres of public land to the railroad builders. It was the government that gave the manufacturers of farm machinery a monopoly of the domestic market by a protective tariff that was no longer necessary to shelter infant industries. It was the government that contracted the national currency and sparked a deflationary cycle that crushed debtors and fattened the wallets of creditors. And those who made the great fortunes then used them to buy the legislative and judicial favors that kept them on top. So the populists recognized one great principle. The job of preserving equality of opportunity and democracy demanded the end of that unholy alliance between government and wealth. It was, to quote that same platform again, from the same womb of governmental injustice that both tramps and millionaires were made. But how? How to restore government to the job of promoting the general welfare. And here the populists made a breakthrough to another principle. In a modern, large-scale, industrial, and nationalized economy, it simply wasn't enough to curb the government's outreach. That would simply leave power in the hands of the great corporations whose existence was inseparable from growth and progress. The answer was to turn government into an active player in the economy, at the very least enforcing fair play, and when necessary, being the friend, the helper, and the agent of the people at large in their eternal struggle against organized power. So, the populist platform called for government loans to farmers about to lose their mortgaged homesteads, for government granaries to grade and store their crops fairly, for governmental inflation of the currency, which was a classical plea of debtors, and for some decidedly non-classical actions like government ownership of the railroad, telephone, and telegraph systems, and a graduated, that is, progressive tax on incomes, and a flat ban on subsidies, quote, to any private corporation. And to make sure the government stayed on the side of the people, the POPs called for the initiative and referendum and the direct election of senators. Predictably, the populists were denounced, feared, and mocked as fanatical hayseeds, ignorantly playing the socialist fire. They got 22 electoral votes for their candidate in '92, plus some congressional seats and state houses, but it was downhill from there for many reasons. America wasn't, and probably still isn't, ready for a new major party. And by 1904, the Populist Party was a spent rocket. But if political organizations perish, their ideas don't. Keep that in mind. Indeed, much of the populist agenda would become law within a few years of the party's extension, and that was because it was generally shared by a rising generation of young Republicans and Democrats who, justly or not, were seen as less outrageously outdated than the embattled farmers. These were your forebears and mine. These were the progressives. One of my heroes in all of this was a man whose almost every word I read growing up, William Allen White, a Kansas country editor, a Republican, who was one of them. And he described the group this way. What the people felt about the vast injustice that had come with the settlement of the continent, we, their servants, teachers, city councilors, legislators, governors, publishers, editors, writers, representatives in Congress and senators, we all made a part of our creed. Some way, he wrote, into the hearts of the dominant middle class of this country had come a sense that their civilization needed recasting, that their government had fallen into the hands of self-seekers, and that a new relationship would be established between the haves and the have-nots. They were a diverse group, held together by a common admiration of progress, hence the name, and a shared dismay at the paradox of poverty stubbornly persisting in the midst of progress like an unwanted guest at a wedding. Of course, they welcomed, as we do, the new marvels in the gift bag of technology, the telephones, the autos, the electrically powered urban transport and lighting systems, the indoor heating and plumbing, the processed foods and home appliances, and machine-made clothing that reduced the sweat and drudgery of homemaking and were affordable to an ever-swelling number of people. But they saw the underside, too. The slums lurking in the shadows of the glittering cities, the exploited and unpredicted workers whose low-paid labor filled the horn of plenty for others, the misery of those whom age, sickness, accident, and hard times condemned to servitude and poverty with no hope of comfort and security. You know, this is what's hard to believe. Within 100 years after 1776, while the still young revolution was still in its infancy, it was being strangled in the hard grip of a ruling class. The large corporations that were called into being by modern industrialization after 1865, the end of the Civil War, had combined into trusts, making minions of both politicians and government. What Henry George called an immense wedge was being forced through American society by the maldistribution of wealth, status, and opportunity. I'm here to remind you that this is Karl Rove's cherished period of American history. It was, as I read him, and I've read a lot about him, the seminal influence on the man who is said to be George W.'s brain. I am not making this up. Karl Rove has modeled the Bush presidency on that of William McKinley, who was in the White House from 1897 to 1901, and modeled himself on Mark Hanna, the man who virtually manufactured McKinley. Hanna served corporate and imperial power. It was said of him that he believed, quote, without compunction, that the state of Ohio, like the state of Texas today, existed for property. It had no other function. Great wealth was to be gained through monopoly, through using the state for private ends. It was axiomatic, therefore, that businessmen should run the government and run it for personal profit. I'm not making this up. You can read those ideas every day on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. Just the other day, they said the people who don't make enough money to pay taxes are lucky duckies. And a few weeks ago, they ran a column in which they said the only real problem with the economy is that it is so boring, that it used to be social fun to talk about stocks. Mark Hanna, Karl Rove's hero, made William McKinley governor of Ohio by shaking down the corporate interests of the day, the pioneers and rangers of their time. McKinley had the invaluable gift of emitting sonorous platitudes as though they were recently discovered truth. Under his pleasant gaze, and through the wily intrigues of Mark Hanna, first Ohio and then Washington were ruled by business, by bankers, by railroads, and by public utility corporations. And any who opposed this oligarchy as you tonight were smeared as disturbers of the peace, socialists, anarchists, or worse. Back then, they didn't bother with hollow euphemisms like compassionate conservatism to disguise the raw reactionary politics that produce government of, by, and for the ruling corporate class. They just saw the loot and went for it. The historian Clinton Rossiter describes this as the period of the great train robbery of American intellectual history. Conservatives, or better, pro-corporate apologists, hijacked the vocabulary of Jeffersonian liberalism and turned words like progress, opportunity, and individualism into tools for making the rape of America sound like a consensual date. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was hijacked too, so that conservative politicians, judges, and publicists promoted as if it were the natural order of things the notion that progress resulted from the elimination of the weak and the survival of the fittest. And this degenerate and unlovely age, as one historian calls it, exists in the mind of Karl Rove, the brain of George W. Bush, remember, as the seminal age of inspiration. I guess I deserve their award after all. But no wonder that what troubled our progressive forebears was not only the miasma of poverty in their nostrils, but the sour stink of a political system for sale. The United States Senate was a millionaire's club. Money given to the political machines that control nominations could buy controlling influence in city halls, state houses, and even courtrooms. You could even stack the Supreme Court with money. Reforms and improvements ran into the immovable resistance of the almighty dollar. And what, progressives wondered, what would all this do to the principles of popular government? Because all of them, whatever party they subscribed to, and hear me, all of them, Republicans and Democrats, were inspired by the gospel of democracy. And inevitably, that swept them into the current of politics, whether as active office holders or persistent advocates. There are a lot of young people here tonight, and I just want to take a minute to give you a small but representative sampling of their ranks, because my time has come. The time of many people in this organization has come and gone, but your time is coming, and you are our hope. Listen. Jane Addams forsook the comforts of a middle-class college graduate's life to live in Hull House in the midst of a disease-ridden and crowded Chicago immigrant neighborhood and make it an educational and social center that would bring pride, health, and beauty into the lives of her poor neighbors. She was inspired, she wrote, by an almost passionate devotion to the ideals of democracy and to combating the prevailing notion of the day that the well-being of a privileged few might justly be built upon the ignorance and sacrifice of the many. Community and fellowship were the lessons she drew from her teachers, Jesus and Abraham Lincoln. But people simply helping one another, she discovered, couldn't move mountains of disadvantage. She learned that private beneficence wasn't enough. It would take more than soup kitchens and fundraising prayer meetings, more than faith-based initiative. Social arrangements, she wrote, can be transformed through our conscious and deliberate effort. Take note, not individual regeneration or the magic of the market, but conscious, collaborative, cooperative effort. Meet a couple of muckraking journalists. Jacob Riis lugged his heavy camera up and down the staircases of New York's disease-ridden fire-trapped tenements to photograph the unspeakable crowding, the inadequate toilets, the starved and hollow-eyed children, and the filth on the walls so thick that his crude flash equipment sometimes set it afire. Bound between hard covers with Reese's commentary, they showed comfortable New Yorkers how the other half lives. And they were powerful ammunition for reformers who eventually brought an end to tenement housing by state legislation. And Lincoln Steffens, college and graduate school educated, left his books to learn from the bottom up as a police beat reporter on New York streets. Then as a magazine reporter, he exposed the links between city bosses and businessmen that made it possible for builders, and factory owners to ignore safety codes and get away with it. But he said the villain was neither the boodler nor the businessman. It was the indifference of a public that deplored our politics and lauded our business that transformed law, medicine, literature, and religion simply into business. Steffens was out to slay that dragon that exalted the commercial spirit over the goals of patriotism and national prosperity. I am not a scientist, he wrote. I'm a journalist. I did not gather the facts and arrange them patiently for permanent preservation and laboratory analysis. My purpose was to see if the shameful facts spread out in all their shame would not burn through our civic shamelessness and set fire to the American spirit. If corrupt politics bred diseases, and I hear this from young people today who are deep into cynicism because they believe nothing can be changed and they'll pursue their private lives. If corrupt politics bred diseases that could be mortal to democracy, then good politics was the antidote. So was the discovery of Ray Baker, another journalistic progressive who started out with a detestation of election time catchwords and slogans. But he came to see, and I'm reading from his diary, politics could not be abolished or adjourned. It was in its essence the method by which communities worked out their common problems. It was one of the principal arts, politics, one of the principal arts of living peacefully in a crowded world. Compare that to Grover Norquist's latest declaration of war on the social contract. We are trying, said Norquist last week, to change the tones in the state capitol and turn them toward bitter nastiness and partisanship. Bipartisanship, Norquist said, is another name for date rape. They have put us on warning. Anyone who doesn't take this seriously is going to be swept aside in the coming fight. There are more, too many more to call to the witness stand here tonight. But I want you to hear some of the things that they had to say. There were educators and economists like John R. Commons or the sociologist Edward Rawls who believed that the function of social science wasn't simply to dissect society for non-judgmental analysis and academic promotion, but to help in finding solutions to social problems. It was Rawls who pointed out that morality in the modern world had a social dimension. In Sin and Society, written in 1907, long before Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society, he told readers that the sins blackening the face of our time were of a new variety and not yet recognized. The man who picks pockets with a railroad rebate, one might say a tax shelter in Bermuda, murders with an adulterer instead of a bludgeon, burglarizes with a rake-off instead of a jimmy, cheats with a company instead of a deck of cards, or scuttles his town instead of his ship, does not feel on his brow the brand of a malefactor. He goes to bed to sleep, the sleep of the just. And here are just two final bits of testimony from actual politicians. First, one of my heroes, Bran Whitlock, the mayor of Toledo. He first learned his politics as a beat reporter in Chicago, confirming my experience that there's nothing better than journalism to turn life into a continuing course in adult education. One of his lessons was that the alliance between the lobbyists and the lawyers of the great corporate interest on the one hand and the managers of both the great political parties on the other was a fact, the worst feature of which was that no one seemed to care. Then there's Tom Johnson, the progressive mayor of Cleveland in the early 1900s, a businessman converted to social activism. That's why I don't want to believe that in this class war, we've lost all the businessmen and all the rich people. We haven't. There's enormous possibility. You should see some of them in this room. There's enormous possibility for awakening the conscience of business people and rich people who understand that you don't have to feel guilt to love justice. Johnson's major battles. Johnson's major battles were to impose regulation or even municipal takeover on the private companies that provided public transportation and utilities. They crushed competitors. They overcharged customers. They secured franchises and licenses for a song, and they paid virtually nothing in taxes, all through their pocketbook control of lawmakers and judges. Johnson's argument for public ownership was simple: if you don't know them, they will own you. We've held that position in the campaign for public funding for public officials, that if anybody's going to own the politicians, it might as well be the people. When advised that businessmen, let me be clear on something. These progressives weren't all saints. Their glory years coincided with the heyday of lynching and segregation, of empire and the big stick and the bold theft of the Panama Canal, of immigration restriction and ethnic stereotypes. Some of the progressives, as I said, were themselves businessmen only hoping to control an unruly marketplace by regulation. But by and large, they were conservative reformers. They aimed to preserve the balance between wealth and commonwealth. Their common enemy was unchecked privilege. Their common hope was a better democracy. And their common weapon was informed public opinion. In a few short years, the progressive spirit made possible the election not only of reform mayors and governors, but of national figures like Senator George Norris of Nebraska or Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and even that hard-to-classify political genius, Theodore Roosevelt. All three of them Republicans. Here is the simplest laundry list of what was accomplished at the state and federal levels. Publicly regulated or owned transportation, sanitation, and utility systems. The partial restoration of competition in the marketplace through improved antitrust laws. Increased fairness in taxation. Expansion of public education and juvenile justice systems. Safer workplaces and guarantees of compensation to workers injured on the job, oversight of the purity of water, medicines, and foods, conservation of the national wilderness heritage against overdevelopment, and honest bidding on any public mining, lumbering, and ranching. Things that we now take for granted or did, all provided not by the automatic workings of free enterprise, but by implementing the idea in the Declaration of Independence that the people have a right to government that promotes their safety and their happiness. That mighty progressive wave peaked in 1912, but these ideas that were unleashed by it forged politics in the 20th century. Like his cousin Teddy, Franklin Roosevelt argued that the real enemy of enlightened capitalism were the malefactors of great wealth, the economic royalists from whom it was necessary to save capitalism by reform and regulation. Progressive government became an embedded tradition of Democrats, the heart of FDR's New Deal, Harry Truman's Fair Deal, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. It had its final fling in the landslide of 1964, when LBJ, who was a son of the West Texas Hill Country, where the Populist Rebellion had been nurtured in the 1890s, won the endorsement for what he meant at the time to be the capstone of the arch of the New Deal. I had a modest role in that era. I shared in its exhilaration and its failures. We went too far too fast. We overreached at home and in Vietnam. We failed to examine some assumptions. We misjudged the rising discontents and the fierce backlash engendered by war, race, civil disturbance, violence, and crime. Democrats grew so proprietary in this town that a sterile political establishment grew so fat and complacent it couldn't recognize its own intellectual bankruptcy or see that a beltway was beginning to separate it from the rest of the country. The failure of democratic politicians and public thinkers to respond to popular discontents, to the daily lives of workers, consumers, parents, and ordinary taxpayers allowed the conservatives to convert public concern and hostility in a crusade to resurrect social Darwinism as a moral philosophy, multinational corporations as a governing class, and the theology of markets as a transcendental belief system. As a citizen, I don't like the consequences of this crusade, but you have to respect the conservatives for their successful strategy in gaining control of American public life. Their stated and open aim is to change how our country is governed, to strip from government all of its functions except those that reward their rich and privileged benefactors. They're quite candid about it, even about their mean spirit in accomplishing it. Their leading strategist in Washington, whom I mentioned a moment ago, Grover Norquist, famously says that he wants to shrink the government down to the size that it could be drowned in a bathtub. More recently, in commenting on the fiscal crisis in the states and its effect on schools and poor people, Norquist said, "I hope one of them," meaning one of the states, "goes bankrupt." So much for compassionate conservatism. But at least Norquist says what he means and means what he says. The White House pursues the same homicidal dream without saying so. Instead of shrinking down the government, they're filling the bathtub with so much debt that it floods the house, waterlogs the economy, and washes away services that have lifted millions of Americans out of destitution for decades. And what happens once the public's property has been flooded? Privatize it and sell it at a discounted rate to the corporations. I actually disagree with Barney. I don't think this is the consequence of ignorance. I think this is deliberate, intentional destruction of the United States way of government. It is the most radical assault on the notion of one nation indivisible that has occurred in over 100 years. And I simply don't understand it or the malice in which it is steeped. Many people are nostalgic for a golden age. These people seem sincerely to long for the Gilded Age. That I can grasp. But I can't explain the rage of the counter-revolutionaries to dismantle every last brick of the social contract. And I guess that at this advanced age, I simply, and this is hard, I simply have to accept the reality that the tension between haves and have-nots is built into the human psychology and into society itself. It's ever been with us. To be frank, I'm just as puzzled as to why, with right-wing wrecking crews blasting away at social benefits once considered invulnerable, Democrats are fearful of being labeled class warriors. Why the Democrats are fearful of being labeled class warriors in a war the other side started and is winning. I truly don't get why conceding your opponent's premises and fighting on his turf isn't the surefire prescription for irrelevance and ultimately obsolescence. But I confess as well, my old habits still persist. but I'm not partisan. I confess as well that I don't know how to resolve the social issues that have driven wedges into liberal ranks, and I don't know how to reconfigure democratic politics to fit into an age of sound bites and policy dominated by a media oligopoly whose corporate journalists are neutered and whose right-wing apologists have no shame. What I do know is this, and I'm quitting. The social dislocations and meanness that galvanized the progressive movement in the 19th century are resurgent. But so is your presence tonight, your enthusiasm, the contagion of a celebration instead of a wake. So is the vision of justice, fairness, and equality, and that's a powerful combination if only there are people willing to fight for them. In addition to reading a lot of Page Smith these days, his several volumes of American history will stir the heart and mind. I've also been checking back with The American Commonwealth by James Bryce, published in 1895 at the height of the first Gilded Age. Americans, Bryce found, were hopeful and philanthropic. He saw the ills of that dark and unlovely age, but he went on to say, 100 times I have been disheartened by the facts I was stating. 100 times has the recollection of the abounding strength and vitality of the nation chased away those tremors. So what will it take to get back in the fight? Understanding the real interests and deep opinions of the American people is the first thing. And what are they? That a Social Security card is not a private portfolio statement, but a membership ticket in a society where we all contribute to a common treasury so that none need face the indignities of poverty and old age. That tax evasion is not a form of conserving investment capital, but a brazen abandonment of responsibility to America. That income inequality is not a sign of freedom of opportunity at work, because if it persists and grows, then unless you believe that some people are naturally born to ride and some to wear saddles, it's a sign that opportunity is less than equal. That self-interest is a great motivator for production and progress, but it is amoral, if not immoral, when not contained within the framework of community. That the rich have the right to buy all the cars they want, all the homes they want, all the vacations they want, all the gadgets and gizmos, but they do not have the right to buy more democracy than anyone else. That public services, when privatized, serve only those who can afford them and weaken the sense that we all rise and fall together as one nation, indivisible. That concentration in the production of goods may sometimes be useful and efficient, but monopoly over the dissemination of ideas is evil. That prosperity requires good wages and benefits for workers, and that our nation can no more survive as half a democracy and half an oligarchy than it could survive half slave and half free, and that keeping it from becoming all oligarchy is steady, heavy work, our work. Ideas have power as long as they're not frozen into doctrine. But ideas need legs. Hear me, young people. The 8-hour day, the minimum wage, the conservation of natural resources and the protection of our air, water, and land, women's rights and civil rights, free trade unions, Social Security, and a social service based on merit, all of these were launched as citizens' movements and won the endorsement of the political class only after long struggles and in the face of bitter opposition and sneering attacks by the Murdochs and DeLays, the Gingriches and Limbaughs of their day. Democracy doesn't work without citizen activism and participation, starting, as Regina said, at the community. Trickle-down politics don't work much better than trickle-down economics. Hear me. Hear me. Civilization happens because we don't leave things to other people. What's right and good doesn't come naturally. You have to stand up and argue and fight for it as if the cause depends on you. Allow yourself that conceit to believe that the flame of democracy will never go out as long as there's one candle in your hand. But 1,000 candles become a searchlight, 1,000 more a floodlight, and 1,000 more a mighty beacon in the sky. I know you have the passion, so go for it. Never mind the odds. Remember that the progressives faced worse 100 and some odd years ago. Karl Rove isn't tougher than Mark Hanna in his time. And 100 years from now, I will wager you, although I'm not like Bill Bennett, a betting man, 100 years from now, I will wager that some historian will be wondering how they let Norquist and company get away with it as long as they did. How they waged war almost unopposed on the infrastructure of social justice, on the arrangements that make life fair, on the mutual rights and responsibilities that offer opportunity, civil liberties, and a decent standard of living to the least among us. Democracy is not a lie. I first learned that from Henry Damaris Lloyd, that progressive journalist whose book Wealth Against Commonwealth laid open the Standard Oil Trust a century ago. Lloyd came to the conclusion that to regenerate the individual is a half-truth. The reorganization of the society, which he makes and which makes him and her, is the other half. The love of liberty, he said, became liberty in America by clothing itself in the complicated group of structures known as the government of the United States. And then he said, democracy is not a lie. There lives in the body of the commonality the unexhausted virtue and the ever-refreshing strength which can rise equal to any problems of progress. And he concluded by saying, as I do, in the hope of tapping some reserve of their power of self-help, this story is told to the people. Remember this story, the progressive story. It's your story. Go out now and pass it on.